In 1925, Colonel Percy Fawcett told the Royal Geographical Society that ancient cities were hidden in the Amazon jungle. They said he had lost his mind. He walked into the forest to prove them wrong, and he vanished forever. More than 100 people died in rescue missions over the next 7 decades. But here is what none of those rescue missions ever asked. Was the city actually there? In 2003, a scientist found 20 of them in the exact same stretch of jungle. The builders were not who Fawcett imagined. In May 2025, the world marked exactly 100 years since Fawcett disappeared. And the answer, when it finally came, was stranger than anything he could have predicted. To understand why Percy Fawcett risked everything, we need to go back to a document sitting in the vaulted reading rooms of the National Library of Rio de Janeiro. It is 10 pages long, written in faded ink on crumbling Portuguese parchment, and it has been there since 1839. It is known only as Manuscript 512. The document claims to be the account of a group of Portuguese bandeirantes, frontier treasure hunters on horseback, who spent 10 years wandering the dense interior of Brazil, searching for legendary silver mines. In 1753, according to the manuscript, they stumbled upon a vast, abandoned city deep in the jungle. Stone buildings overgrown with vines, paved streets, triple archways that reminded them of Roman architecture. A black stone column in the central square topped with a statue of a man pointing north. Hieroglyphic inscriptions in a language none of them could read. The city was completely deserted. They heard roosters crowing, but found no inhabitants. The bandeirantes explored the ruins the next day. They described immense buildings bordering the central square, decorated with relief carvings of what looked like crosses and birds. They found a great hall with columns, its entrance crowned by a carved figure wearing a laurel wreath. They stumbled upon what appeared to be the ruins of a Roman-style amphitheater. Outside the city walls, they discovered a river, and, in the shallows, deposits that glittered like silver and gold. They collected samples, drew copies of the inscriptions they found carved into the stone, and headed back into the wilderness. Nobody knows who actually wrote Manuscript 512. The author's name is missing from the damaged pages. The inscriptions they copied have never been identified, though some scholars noted similarities to Phoenician or ancient Mediterranean alphabets. Historians have debated the document's authenticity for nearly 2 centuries. Most modern scholars consider it a fabrication, but in the early 20th century, for a man like Fawcett, it was proof that civilization had once existed in the heart of South America. Fawcett was not some amateur treasure hunter. Born in 1867 in Torquay, Devon, on England's southwest coast, the same county that had produced Francis Drake and Walter Raleigh, he was a trained military officer who had served in British intelligence in Morocco, where his official cover was cartographer, but his actual mission was spying on the Sultan for the British government. He was commissioned as a lieutenant in the Royal Artillery at just 19 years old, and spent years at outposts across the British Empire before being recruited for espionage work in North Africa. He counted Arthur Conan Doyle among his personal friends. On February 13, 1911, Doyle attended Fawcett's lecture at the Royal Geographical Society about Bolivia's Huanchaca Plateau, where Fawcett described monstrous tracts of unknown origin and showed photographs of flat-topped mountains rising above uncharted jungle. Doyle already had an idea for a novel about South America. Fawcett gave him the raw material. The result was The Lost World, published in 1912. Fawcett himself claimed to have encountered an anaconda over 60 feet long on the Rio Abuna during his first expedition. He said he shot it with a .44 soft-nosed bullet. London zoologists ridiculed the claim, but it fed his growing reputation as a man who had seen things in the jungle that others could not explain. Between 1906 and 1924, Fawcett made 7 official expeditions into the Amazon basin on behalf of the Royal Geographical Society, mapping uncharted borders between Brazil and Bolivia. His very first assignment in 1906 was expected to take 2 years. Fawcett completed it in a few months. These were grueling journeys through territory that routinely killed European explorers with malaria, starvation, and hostile encounters. Fawcett thrived in it. He seemed immune to tropical fevers that destroyed other men. He ate what the indigenous people ate. He moved through the jungle faster than anyone his colleagues had ever seen. The Royal Geographical Society awarded him their gold medal. But with each expedition, Fawcett became less interested in drawing maps and more interested in what the maps were hiding. He found pottery fragments in places where no known civilization should have left them. He listened to indigenous oral traditions about great cities that had existed long before Europeans arrived. He studied Manuscript 512 obsessively and became convinced that its ruined city was real. By 1912, he had given his theory a name. He called the city Z. He believed it lay somewhere in the dense jungle of the Mato Grosso region of Brazil, near the headwaters of the Xingu River. But Fawcett's vision of Z was shaped by more than archaeology. His elder brother Edward had worked alongside Helena Blavatsky, the founder of Theosophy, and introduced Percy to the movement in the 1890s. By the time of his final expedition, Fawcett's concept of Z had drifted from a scientific hypothesis into something closer to a spiritual quest. He wrote articles for occult magazines in Victorian London. He consulted psychics in candlelit parlors. He carried a small jade idol that he claimed had supernatural powers. And he believed his son Jack was a reincarnated spirit with a special destiny. His younger son Brian, who published Fawcett's handwritten journals posthumously in 1953 as the bestseller Exploration Fawcett, deliberately left out what he estimated was 80% of the real material. Brian believed the public was not ready for it. Fawcett spent the years of the First World War fighting in the trenches of the Western Front, where despite being nearly 50 years old, he was recommended for the Distinguished Service Order. But the moment the armistice was signed, he was back on a steamship to South America. His first expedition, specifically for Z, in 1920, was a miserable failure. He was forced to turn back after falling ill and having to shoot his pack animal. But Fawcett was not the kind of man who accepted failure. In 1924, he secured funding from a consortium of North American newspapers and the Rockefellers. He assembled a 3-man party, just himself, his 21-year-old son Jack, and Jack's friend Raleigh Reimel. He refused to take a larger group. He refused to take a radio. He believed a small, fast team would succeed where larger expeditions had failed. Nina Fawcett, Percy's wife, had begged to join the expedition. She was born in Ceylon, the daughter of a colonial judge, and had met Percy at a tennis party at the British fort at Galway. She could navigate by the stars. She had taught Percy how to use his theodolite. She was one of the first women in England to drive a car. But Fawcett always refused her requests. The jungle, he believed, was no place for a woman. It would be Nina who spent the rest of her life defending his reputation, moving to Lima, Peru, holding seances to contact Percy, and telling the New York Times she had received telepathic messages from her husband as late as 1934. She died in 1954, still convinced that Percy and Jack would return. On April 20th, 1925, the 3 men departed Cuiabá and headed east into the jungle. They traveled light, with supplies for roughly 3 weeks, crossing first through the Cerrado, the dry forest region, where they contended with treacherous gorges, hunger, and the ever-present threat of illness. Rimmel, who was only 21 like Jack, was already struggling with an infected foot. The journey would take them across rivers and through territories belonging to indigenous groups who had killed outsiders before. Fawcett had written to the Royal Geographical Society before departing with a grim instruction. If the expedition failed, no rescue party should come looking for them. The jungle was too dangerous, and it would only claim more lives. For 5 weeks, local runners carried Fawcett's handwritten letters back along the jungle trail, and his dispatches were printed on the front pages of newspapers around the world. 40 million readers were following the story. Then on May 29th, from a camp called Dead Horse Camp, named for a horse that had died there on his previous expedition 5 years earlier, he wrote his final letter. He wrote to Nina, "You need have no fear of any failure." After that letter, silence. He was 57 years old. In 2025, a researcher at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro published the first formal paleographic analysis of another Fawcett note from that same expedition. A message to Hermenegildo Galvão on May 7, 1925, still preserved in Rio's National Historical Museum. 100 years on, and scholars are still examining his handwriting for clues. The theories about what happened to Fawcett have never stopped. The Kalapalo, people who lived in the territory where the expedition was heading, told journalist David Gran in 2005 that they had watched the expedition's campfire smoke for 5 evenings before it vanished over the horizon. The chief told him that people always say the Kalapalas killed the Englishmen, but we did not. We tried to save them. A Swiss hunter named Stefan Ratin reported in 1931 that he had encountered a tall older man with blue eyes being held captive by indigenous people in northwestern Mato Grosso. The man identified himself as a British Army colonel. Before he was led away, he pressed a signet ring into Ratin's hand. Fawcett's wife, Nina, later confirmed it was her husband's ring. Ratin organized his own rescue expedition. He walked into the jungle and was never seen again. In 1928, a British explorer named George Miller Dyott launched an expedition the day after his wedding. Deep in the jungle, he found an indigenous chief in possession of Fawcett's trunk. Dyott was held captive and barely escaped alive. Albert de Winton, a Welsh-born Hollywood actor known for B-movies like King of the Wild, entered the Xingu alone in 1933, vowing to find Fawcett dead or alive. He died in May 1934. As late as 1996, a wealthy Brazilian businessman named James Lynch brought his 16-year-old son on a multi-million-dollar expedition and was captured by Amazonian warriors armed with bows and heavy clubs. They were released only after surrendering $30,000 worth of equipment. In total, 13 official expeditions were launched. The mystery consumed lives for 7 decades. But all the books and films and expeditions focused on the wrong question. They asked what happened to the man. The real question, the one Fawcett would have cared about, was whether his lost city existed. What we do know is that Fawcett was heading directly into the upper Xingu, the headwater region of one of the Amazon's great tributaries, looking for evidence of a lost civilization. Now fast forward 67 years to 1992. An American archaeologist named Michael Heckenberger, a doctoral student at the University of Pittsburgh, met Kuikuro chief Afukaka at the 1992 United Nations Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro. The two men lived together for roughly 6 months during the summit. In December 1992, Heckenberger traveled with Afukaka by small propeller airplane, rattling bus, and flatbed truck to the banks of the Xingu River, then motored 12 hours downriver in a wooden boat. He arrived at the Kuikuro village at 1 in the morning, under a full moon reflecting off the dark water. He waded chest-deep through a flooded river crossing where a bridge had washed out, convinced at any moment that a prehistoric jacare would emerge from the water and snatch him. When he saw the rounded thatched houses arranged around the ceremonial plaza under the moonlight, he later recalled having an "oh my God" moment. At the time, the Amazon was, in his words, the biggest black hole in the world of archaeology. The Kuikuro initially thought he was digging for gold. Villagers saw his excavation pits and circulated rumors he was a foreigner who had come to exploit their resources. But Heckenberger stayed, year after year. He lived in Afkaka's house for roughly 3 years in total. The chief eventually gave him a Kuikuro name, Maikejana, and the data that emerged from those decades of patient fieldwork would rewrite the history of the Amazon. What Heckenberger found over the next decade would eventually be published in 2 landmark papers in the journal Science, one in September 2003 and the other in August 2008. Across the upper Xingu, spread over an area of roughly 20,000 square kilometers, roughly the size of New Jersey, Heckenberger mapped the remains of approximately 20 interconnected towns and villages. This was the Kuhikugu archaeological complex, and its scale was staggering. The largest settlements covered more than 50 hectares each, capable of housing at least 2,500 people. They were surrounded by defensive ditches and wooden palisade walls. Inside, wide roads connected residential clusters to central ceremonial plazas, stretching 150 meters across. The roads between towns were engineered to be arrow-straight and up to 50 meters wide. To put that in perspective, a modern 4-lane highway is about 25 meters wide. These were roads twice as wide as a highway, cut through the Amazon forest, running in perfectly straight lines for kilometers at a time. Shorter avenues inside each settlement pointed toward the same compass directions, as if every town had been built from an identical master plan. That discovery is what stunned Heckenberger. It implied a centralized planning authority coordinating construction across a vast region. Smaller satellite villages were linked to the main settlements by secondary roads, and canoe canals ran alongside some of them, creating a dual transportation network of land and water. Bridges crossed rivers and defensive ditches. The entire system showed evidence of a deliberately designed urban hierarchy that had no known equivalent in the pre-Columbian Amazon. When Heckenberger compared the prehistoric settlement patterns to the tiny contemporary Kuikuro villages, the contrast was dramatic. The ancient sites were up to 10 times the residential area of the modern villages. What had once been a dense urban network was now occupied by a few hundred people, the survivors of centuries of disease and displacement. The population that built and maintained this network was estimated at between 30,000 and 50,000 people at its peak, roughly 1,500 to 400 years ago. They practiced sophisticated agriculture using enriched terra preta soils, the black earth created over centuries by composting organic waste, charcoal, and ceramics into the naturally poor jungle floor. They grew manioc in managed fields around the towns, built dams and ponds for fish farming that some of their Kuikuro descendants still use today, and maintained orchards of fruit trees that altered the composition of the surrounding forest. And the Kuhikugu were not the only ones who solved this problem. In January 2025, a nature study revealed that the Casarabe culture in Bolivia developed industrial-scale maize monoculture with 2 harvests per year. 2 civilizations, 2 completely different agricultural strategies, both sustaining urban populations in a place mainstream science said could never support them. And then came the line that changed the conversation. Heckenberger wrote in Science that the Xingu road network was, in his words, a better pre-industrial analog for downtown Manhattan, in terms of communication and traffic, than classical Greece. He wrote that Athens may have had remarkable architecture and sculptures, but once you left the polis, you would find yourself on a goat path leading to who knows where. In the upper Xingu, it was impossible to get lost. He called the overall settlement pattern galactic urbanism, borrowing a concept from Harvard anthropologist Stanley Tambia, who had used it in 1977 to describe Southeast Asian kingdoms arranged like mandalas around ceremonial centers. These were not cities in the traditional sense. There was no Kuhikugu equivalent of Rome or Tenochtitlan. Instead, there was something that may have been even harder to build and sustain. A network of independent but cooperating communities spread across thousands of square kilometers of forest. They maintained a shared culture, a shared architectural language, and a shared infrastructure for over 1,000 years. Like and subscribe if you want to keep seeing discoveries like this. We cover archaeological mysteries every week, and the next one is already in production. Now here is where this story takes the turn that most documentaries about Fawcett never reach. Fawcett was searching for Z in almost exactly the same region where Heckenberger found the Kuhikugu complex, the upper Xingu, the headwaters, the place Fawcett believed held his lost city. He was right that ancient cities existed there. The vindication, 80 years later, is real. But Fawcett was also catastrophically wrong about almost everything else. He imagined Z as a city built by non-indigenous people. In his writings, he described the founders as having red hair and blue eyes. He expected to find stone architecture reminiscent of the ruins described in Manuscript 512, with arches and columns and inscriptions in an unknown script. The reality was the complete opposite. The Kuhikugu civilization was built entirely by indigenous peoples, specifically by Arawak-speaking groups who had migrated from western Amazonia over 2,000 years ago as part of a diaspora that Heckenberger compared in scope to the Austronesian expansion across the Pacific. The Arawak language family was the most widespread in pre-Columbian Latin America, stretching from the Caribbean to the southern Amazon. The Taino, the first people Columbus encountered in the New World, spoke an Arawak language, and the ancestors of the Kuikuro, who still live in the upper Xingu today, carried that tradition into the heart of the continent. And they were not alone. In 1541, a Spanish friar named Gaspar de Carvajal traveled down the Amazon with conquistador Francisco de Orellana. He described cities so densely populated that if you were to drop a pin from the sky, it would land on the head of an Indian. For centuries, historians dismissed Carvajal's account as exaggeration or outright fabrication. Now, LiDAR and ground-based archaeology suggest he may have been telling the truth all along. There was a historical footnote that makes the hair stand up on the back of your neck. In 1723, a Brazilian frontiersman named Antonio Pires de Campos wrote a report about his journey through the headwaters of the Tapajos River, just west of the Xingu. In one day's march, he wrote, you would pass 10 or 12 villages, each containing 10 to 30 houses, some of them 30 to 40 paces across. Their roads, he wrote, were very straight and wide, and they kept them so clean that you would not find even a fallen leaf. 2 centuries later, Michael Heckenberger would excavate those same roads, still visible beneath the forest, running in straight lines up to 40 meters wide. Pires de Campos also described a moment of contact. Over 200 canoes approached his party, each carrying 20 to 40 warriors, playing trumpets and drums, and dancing in squadron formations on the shore. Thousands upon thousands of people. And then, within 100 years, almost all of them were gone. But what made the Kuhikugu builders invisible to European eyes was the way they built. No stone temples, no pyramids, earth, wood, and organic materials, all of which decompose in a tropical rainforest within centuries. European explorers never recognized what they were standing on. They were looking for stone ruins, because that was the only kind of city they understood. The Kuhikugu built something different, something that worked with the forest rather than against it. And when European diseases reached the upper Xingu, the collapse was total. The diseases traveled faster than Europeans themselves. Smallpox, measles, and influenza spread along the same indigenous trade networks that had sustained the Kuhikugu economy, carried by asymptomatic traders paddling canoes from coastal populations who had direct European contact. The settlements began emptying in the 1600s, when German physician Karl von den Steinen paddled down the Xingu River on the first peaceful European visit to the Upper Xingu in 1884. He found only 3,000 people in 31 small villages. The Kuikuro remember him as Kalusi, the first white man who came in peace. But the 50-hectare walled towns were long abandoned. By 1926, the population had fallen to 1,840. After a 1946 influenza epidemic brought by a government expedition, it dropped to 700. Then, in 1954, measles swept through from a government medical post. 600 people fell ill. 114 died in a single month. 1 in 5 inhabitants of the entire region gone in weeks. The Kuikuro village of La Hatua was abandoned because too few people were left alive to sustain it. The cultural toll continues today. The Yawalapiti language, once spoken across the Upper Xingu, now has only 4 or 5 living speakers. Chief Aritana Yawalapiti, one of the last fluent elders, died of COVID-19 in August 2020. An entire way of speaking about the world, disappearing in real time. The population began recovering after 1965, when systematic vaccination programs reached the Xingu. Growth has averaged 3 to 4% annually, more than double Brazil's national rate. By 2022, approximately 6,200 people lived in the Xingu Indigenous Park. The Kuikuro, at roughly 800 people, are now the most populous Upper Xingu group. But even at 6,200, the total population remains at only 10 to 20% of its estimated pre-Columbian peak. And new threats have arrived. Mercury from illegal gold mining contaminates the waterways. Over 60,000 hectares of the park burned in 2024. The forest that grew back over the abandoned plazas is now being burned a second time. Fawcett himself probably held pieces of Kuhikugu in his own hands without knowing it. During his earlier expeditions, he documented finding large numbers of clay pottery fragments scattered across the jungle floor. The Kuhikugu sites produce significant quantities of decorated ceramics. Researchers now believe that legends about these settlements, passed down through indigenous oral traditions, may have been among the stories that filtered to Fawcett and fueled his conviction that something extraordinary lay hidden in the Xingu. He had the right coordinates. He had the right instinct. He just imagined the wrong civilization. And the story does not end with Heckenberger's publications. In 2022, archaeologist Eduardo Neves at the University of São Paulo received a $1.8 million grant from the National Geographic Society for a project called Amazônia Revelada. The goal was to use LiDAR technology to systematically map archaeological sites across the Brazilian Amazon. Phase 1 scanned 1,600 square kilometers of forest and immediately delivered results that stunned the team. Near the Príncipe da Beira fortress in Rondônia, archaeologist Carlos Zimpel Neto used the LiDAR data to discover a lost 18th century Portuguese colony called Braganca, completely swallowed by jungle, with evidence of far older indigenous geoglyphs underneath it. Geoglyphs were also found north of the Purus River in Amazonas state, where none had ever been recorded before. Phase 2, covering a substantially larger area, launched in April 2025. But when the Amazônia Revelada team approached the Kuikuro about conducting airplane LiDAR flyovers of their territory, the Kuikuro said no. Not because they opposed the research, but because they did not want data about their sacred sites to become public. So the project adapted. Instead of flying survey airplanes over Kuikuro land, the team provided the community with a small white drone equipped with LiDAR sensors. An indigenous technical geographer named Kumesi Waura began piloting it himself over the forest canopy. and a young man named Viola Kuikuro, barely 25 years old, learned to fly the drones alongside him, trained by archaeologists from the Goeldi Museum in Belém. In June 2025, Viola flew his second LiDAR mission over the Anitahagu excavation site near Ipatse village as part of a new CNPq-funded project called Vozes da Amazônia, led by archaeologist Helena Lima. All data is stored on the community's own servers. The researchers receive access only at the levels the community grants. In 2023, a team including Kumesi Waura and 7 other Kuikuro co-authors published a paper in Science Advances proving that the dark earth found throughout the region was deliberately manufactured. The Kuhikugu builders had intentionally engineered their soil. The Kuikuro call this soil Eegepe. Their ancestors invented it. They still use the same techniques today. When Heckenberger's team published their first science paper in 2003, with Chief Afukaka listed as co-author, the chief said something that cut through decades of academic dismissal in a single sentence. Research has made the white men believe us. Think about that for a moment. In 1925, a British colonel walked into this exact region searching for a lost civilization, convinced that the indigenous people living there could not possibly have built anything of significance. He was so certain the city must have been built by someone else that he brought theories about red-haired, blue-eyed founders. Exactly 100 years later, in 2025, the descendants of the people he dismissed are flying laser-equipped drones over the ruins of their own ancestors' cities, controlling the data, controlling the narrative, and proving that they were the architects all along. The Kuhikugu complex remains largely unexcavated. The 20 known settlements represent what ground-based archaeology has been able to map over 3 decades. Heckenberger himself noted that his mapped sites represent only the clusters where major walled centers have been confirmed. He identified additional hypothetical clusters based on settlement patterns, suggesting the true extent of the Xingu civilization may be significantly larger than what has been documented so far. LiDAR surveys, including the limited drone-based work the Kuikuro are conducting, have the potential to reveal far more. But the clock is ticking. In 2024, the Amazon recorded its worst fire season since monitoring began in 1985. Over 15.6 million hectares burned, more than 60,000 hectares inside the Xingu Indigenous Park alone. For the first time, fire-driven carbon emissions from the Amazon surpassed those from deforestation. In July 2025, Sikan Kalapalo described the river his people have lived on for centuries. He said, "We have to push the boat to pass at some points." The water level was the lowest anyone could remember. The Kalapalo are the same people who watched Percy Fawcett's campfire smoke disappear over the horizon 100 years ago. In December 2025, Brazil's Congress overrode presidential vetoes on the country's environmental licensing law. Companies can now effectively self-license most development projects. The MT-322 highway, which would cut through the buffer zone of the Xingu Indigenous Park, advanced through federal licensing that same year. The archaeological sites that Heckenberger spent 30 years mapping are now in the direct path of infrastructure that was illegal 12 months ago. And yet the discoveries keep accelerating. Across the Amazon basin, LiDAR is revealing evidence of pre-Columbian civilizations at a pace that would have astonished Fawcett. In Ecuador, over 6,000 earthen platforms dating to 500 BCE, with roads stretching more than 25 kilometers through the jungle. In Bolivia, 22-meter pyramids surrounded by causeways and canals that required moving 570,000 cubic meters of soil. In Accra, Brazil, more than 450 geometric earthworks spanning 250 kilometers, circles and squares and hexagons that can only be seen from the air. And in Rondonia, the Amazônia Revelada LiDAR survey revealed a lost Portuguese colony sitting right on top of pre-Columbian earthworks, with ceramics dating back 2,000 years. Layers of civilization, stacked on top of each other, all invisible under the canopy. In November 2025, a multi-institutional study in PNAS demonstrated that the ecological footprints of pre-Columbian peoples are still shaping the composition of modern Amazonian forests. The research plots scientists have been using for decades to define natural rainforest are concentrated along rivers, precisely where ancient populations were densest. We have been studying human-made forests and calling them wilderness. Statistical models predict that between 10,000 and 24,000 ancient earthworks remain hidden beneath the canopy. Only 0.08% of the Amazon has been surveyed with LiDAR. We are at the very beginning. Starting in the 1970s, Smithsonian anthropologist Betty Meggers published a theory arguing that the Amazon's nutrient-poor soils made it physically impossible for complex civilizations to develop there. Only small, mobile groups could survive in the interior, she claimed. Her book, Amazonia: Man and Culture in a Counterfeit Paradise, became the standard reference for 3 decades. Any researcher who suggested otherwise faced professional marginalization. Meggers did not just disagree with the idea of Amazonian civilization. She actively suppressed it. Fawcett was dismissed as a romantic fool chasing fantasies, and every year that his bones were not found seemed to confirm that the Amazon was exactly what Meggers said it was: a green desert, beautiful but empty, incapable of nurturing anything more complex than scattered villages. And then the science caught up. In 2024, a paper in Nature Ecology and Evolution with 5 Kuikuro co-authors proved that indigenous cultural practices over millennia have not degraded, but actively increased Amazonian biodiversity. The forest is richer because people lived in it. The pristine wilderness that Meggers described was never pristine. It was a garden, and the gardeners were the very people the scientific establishment had been ignoring for 300 years. But the cities were there. They were always there. Not the marble temples of his imagination, not the Greco-Roman ruins of Manuscript 512. Something far more remarkable: a network of indigenous urban centers, built from the earth itself, sustained by agricultural systems so sophisticated they manufactured new soil from scratch, connected by engineered roads that would have impressed a Roman surveyor. A civilization that supported tens of thousands of people for over a millennium. And its descendants, now numbering roughly 800 Kuikuro souls, are still there, growing. And today, a Waura geographer named Kumesi flies a laser-equipped drone over the land his community's ancestors transformed, mapping what was hidden, on his own terms, at his own pace, under his own authority. As Eduardo Neves once put it, "The forests are our pyramids." Percy Fawcett never found his lost city, but the lost city found us.